it just kind of lodged there. It was, it then disappearing into the deep brush with frightening speed, sounding like just like a bulldozer, with no engine sounds. And John stood there in shock, his gun temporarily forgotten. And then he realized it was heading towards the house, the way his son had went, So he turned and he ran to the trail, hoping to gain ground on it and eventually cut it off before it reached the clearing. So he hit the trail and ran as fast as he could towards the clearing. And all the while, hearing the creature, thrash through the brush on his side. So you could just imagine the level of adrenaline. He burst into the clearing and just, looked frantically about for his son. John Jr. was standing just inside of the fenced field, waiting for his dad. And John screamed at him to run to the house, And then he saw the thing crash out of the woods about 50 feet to his left, and it crossed the 10-foot clearing, and stepped out over the fence in 2 strides, and was just, was running through the field parallel to his son in a matter of seconds, So John screamed at his son to run faster and took aim at the creature. And he didn't fire because he was afraid to hit his son or his house. So he vaulted over the fence and ran in pursuit of them. And he could see it angling kind of towards his son, and knew there was no way his boy would make it to the gate before it cut him off. In desperation, he pointed the gun to the ground at his side and fired as he ran, hoping to scare it. And it veered more sharply towards his son and put on an enormous burst of speed, he said. He heard his boy scream, and as they seemed to collide, he saw the creature dip its shoulder down a little bit, and suddenly John Jr. was airborne. He flew like about 10 feet and then hit the ground rolling. And the creature never paused. It continued to run at an amazing speed in a loop back towards the woods. And once the line of fire was clear, John stopped and squeezed off the remaining 5 rounds at the retreating creature. He was pretty sure all of the shots, just went wild. Like the creature never made a sound or slowed down, and was soon over the fence and back in the woods. So he reaches his son, and who was shaken up but not physically hurt, and he asked his dad if it was a bear, and apparently Little John was so busy running for the house that he didn't see the creature running after him. And he said something big and black suddenly ran into him, and he felt a huge paw hit his bottom, and he said he felt like he was falling. So John pulls his son to his feet, and they run through the gate and into the house, locking the doors behind them. They were both out of breath and white as ghosts. And his wife was like screaming at him, demanding to know what the gunshots were for and if they were all right. And when he could catch his breath, he told her to make sure that, the back door was locked, and he was going to call the sheriff. And he went to the phone, and he began to dial the number. And you gotta understand, this was before 911, then stopped and wondered what exactly he was going to say when they picked up the phone, So he hung up the phone, realizing that, what an idiot, he would, what an idiot he would look like if he told the sheriff some boogeyman, just chased him out of the woods, right? So he told his wife that it was a large animal, possibly a bear. He didn't know how to begin to tell her their 4-year-old was right. Like his cowman was real. And it was more frightening than anything he could ever imagine. He told them all to keep the doors locked. Stay away from the windows. Around 10 o'clock at night, both boys were in bed, and John and his wife sat down to watch the news. They soon heard a loud moaning cry. Kind of like the siren on the volunteer fire department, like the air siren. And he said it would stretch out for a really, really long time, and then end with a whoop whoop sound, and it was coming from the woods opposite the house. So his wife asks, what the hell is that? And John answered truthfully, the only thing he could do, right? And that is Tim's cowman. So he then, described to her the full details of just what had happened. And she immediately wanted to call the sheriff, and he persuaded her that they would sound crazy, and that he would handle it himself. And she reluctantly agreed and told him she didn't want either of the kids to go outside until this thing was gone. So the howling went on until around midnight, and then it got quite, quiet again. And John wanted to stay up through the night and watch over the house, but he had a long day at work, and, you can imagine the excitement, earlier that had completely worn him out. And they went to bed around 1 in the morning, and had no, real further problems that night. So they slept in the morning, and they slept in that morning, and the boys were, already up and watching cartoons. And when they got out of bed, the first thing Little John said was that he had heard the bear rubbing against the house last night, and he said that he was too scared to get up and to tell his parents, and fell back to sleep soon after. And then Tim chirped up, "The cowman talks funny." And this stopped John cold, This is a big thing you have to realize, is, he asked his son, when did you talk to the cowman? As you can imagine the shock, and Tim replied, "Last night in my room." So, John asked him, "The cowman was in your room?" And, little Tim goes on to say that, "No, Daddy, he's too big for my room. He talked to my window." Oh my God. So, and then, the kid just turned around and started watching cartoons again. And you could, I just freeze out momentarily there, but you can imagine the weight of the situation here, and so, John asked him, what did the cowman say, Tim? And so Tim went on to say that he talks funny. I don't know what it was he said, but he talks like, ooh, ah, ah, ooh. So, he also started making, strange monkey-like noises and gestures. So, John went on to ask him, did the cowman try to get in your window? And, he would start breaking out in a cold sweat. And Tim just replied that he's too big for that. He made funny faces. He has Lincoln log teeth. And he said that with a smile. And John later learned that Tim meant it had square teeth that looked the same size as the small blocks in a Lincoln log set, those old sets. And it apparently spent quite a while talking and making faces outside the boy's window. And Tim said it would lay down and it went to sleep outside the window, and he could hear it snoring. And John walked to his younger son's room and cautiously peered out the window. And there was no sleeping cowman out there. And then, you know, John told the boys to get dressed, and they were going to go visit their uncle in Elma for a while. So, as the story goes, after his wife and kids left, he called one of the men from his crew and asked him to come over. Just for sake of argument, I'll call this man Patrick. He was an ex-state patrolman, and my dad said he was kicked off the force because of his drinking problem. And he was a good worker, you know, and never got drunk before dark, you know. So John figured they would have most of the day to look around for this thing. And when Patrick arrived, John agreed, you know, he greeted him at the door and said, "Are you up for some hunting?" So, seeing how it was not hunting season, you know, Patrick told him that he doesn't poach, you know, and doesn't even want to know about it if John did. And John, you know, assured him it wasn't deer he was after, and went on to explain the previous night's events. So Patrick didn't really believe him. And, you know, but he could see how he was sincere and still shook up. And John had his pistol and bolt action 30-06, and Patrick had his 38 in his car, and John loaned him a 12 gauge. And they first circled the house looking for any signs of the nocturnal visitor. So at the back of the house, there was a spigot for the garden hose, and it always leaked, you know, and there was a patch of ground worn bare of grass underneath it. And it had, you know, turned to mud. And in the center of the mud, there was a huge clear imprint of what looked like a bare human foot. And John said it was at least 18 inches long, very, very wide. It was so clear that he got the feeling that it was almost left there on purpose. And they found no other prints around the house. And in places in the field, like, and woods, where a track could be made, you know, like there was nothing. So, you know, the creature seemed to avoid them, you know, off to the side of the tracks. And the mud were found, like